Sextus Aurelius Victor's book on the emperors. The abbreviated histories of Aurelius Victor, from Augustus Octavian, that is, from the end of Titus Livy, to the 10th consulship of Constantius Augustus, and the 3rd of Julian Caesar. In about the 722nd year of the city, the custom commenced at Rome of obeying one man alone. For Octavian, the son of Octavius, received the cognomen Caesar after being adopted by his great-uncle, and subsequently, through a decree of the nobility, that of Augustus, because he had exploited his party's victory leniently, won over the soldiers with bribes, and the common people by his apparent concern with the grain supply, and subdued the rest without difficulty. When roughly 44 years had passed in that manner, he died of an illness at Nola, having added Raetia and Illyricum to the empire of his fellow citizens, and tamed the fierce spirits of foreign nations, except for Germany, though he was the third after Numa to close the temple of Janus when he had defeated Antony. This would occur according to Roman law when all wars had ceased. The man possessed a charming and gracious disposition, but he had an excessively ardent passion for luxury and the games, and an immoderate desire for sleep. He was a great supporter of learned men who were numerous and his friends, since he was remarkably devoted to the study of eloquence, and of religious practices, and he was called the father of his country because of his clemency, and granted permanent tribunician power. Consequently, temples, priests, and sacral colleges were dedicated to him as a god at Rome, and in the most famous cities in all of the provinces, both while he was alive and after his death. He was so fortunate, except however for his children and also his marriage, that the Indians, Scythians, Bactrians, and Garamantines all sent envoys to beg for an alliance. Thereafter, Claudius Tiberius Nero, admitted by adoption from the position of stepson to be among Augustus's children, when he realized that those circumstances which were causing alarm were safe enough, embraced the imperial power, while shrewdly refusing its title. Cunning and rather secretive, he often pretended to oppose what he especially desired, and insidiously supported what he detested. His mind was far sharper in making sudden decisions. After a good beginning, he subsequently became pernicious, given to the most unnatural lusts for persons of practically every age and sex, and punishing all too cruelly the innocent and the guilty alike, including his own relatives. Moreover, in the period when he detested cities and assemblies, he sought out the Isle of Capri as a cover for his shameful activities. Therefore, since military affairs were neglected, a great part of the Roman Empire was ravished, and no new province was formed except for Cappadocia, and that at the beginning of his reign, when King Archelaus had been removed. The predatory raids of the Gautiuli, which had broken out everywhere under the leadership of Tacfarianus, were suppressed. At the same time, Maroboduus, the king of the Suebi, was cunningly entrapped. Furthermore, he collected from every quarter the Praetorian cohorts, which had been kept dispersed and lodged in private homes at Rome or in the nearby municipalities, and concentrated them in a camp near the city, calling the authority by which they were controlled the Praetorian Prefecture, which was an increase in status, for Augustus had instituted other bodyguards and guard units. And so Tiberius, when he had ruled for 23 years and was 79 years old, was overcome by a fever or a plot, and Gaius Caesar, surnamed Caligula, was appointed with universal consent because of his ancestry and his father. For Augustus, through his daughter, was his great-grandfather, and his grandfathers were Agrippa on his mother's side and Drusus, father of Germanicus, who was his father. The common people were greatly moved by their modesty and by their untimely deaths, except for Octavian's, as well as by the deaths of his mother and brothers, whom Tiberius had eliminated in various ways. For this reason, everyone strove to mitigate the misfortunes of such a great family with their expectations of the very young man. Then again, because he had been born in the army, where he had acquired his surname from a military boot, he was loved and accepted by the legions. Furthermore, all the most sensible people believed that he would be like his relatives, but it turned out quite differently, as if by some law of nature, which frequently, as if by design, produces bad men from good, boors from quite learned men, and others of this kind or the opposite. In fact, from his example, many intelligent men have decided that it is more beneficial not to have children. Moreover, in Caligula's case, they were not very far from the truth, insomuch as for a long time he had so concealed the enormities of his nature by his proper behaviour and pretence of obedience, that it was justly said in public that there had never been better servants, nor a harsher master than he. Finally, after obtaining power, as is customary with people of such a disposition at the beginning, for several months of that year he granted extraordinary benefits to the people, the senators, and the soldiers, and when a conspiracy had been reported, as if he did not believe it, he declared that it could hardly have been undertaken against him, whose life was a burden or detriment to no one. But suddenly, after he had first killed a few innocent people through various crimes, he revealed the nature, as it were, of a wild beast that has tasted blood. And so thereafter 3 years passed while the world was defiled with the widespread murders of senators and nobles. Furthermore, he amused himself by debauching his sisters and mockingly marrying noble women, and would go about dressed like a god, since he claimed that he was Jupiter on account of his incest, but also Liber because of his chorus of Bacchantes. Similarly, he concentrated his legions in one place, with the expectation of crossing over into Germany, then ordered them to gather mussels and cockles on the shore of the ocean, while he himself went among them at times in the flowing robe of Venus, at other times in full armour. He would say that he was taking spoils not from men but from the gods, doubtless because he had heard that according to the Greeks, who love to embellish everything, fish of this kind are called nymphs' eyes. Elated by this, he had attempted to have himself addressed as lord and to fasten royal insignia to his head. Consequently, at the instigation of Charia, those who possessed Roman courage were impelled to deliver the state from such a terrible scourge by stabbing him to death. And that outstanding exploit of Brutus when he expelled Tarquinius would have been repeated, if only the true Romans had been performing their military service. But when through apathy the citizens conceived the desire to draft foreigners and barbarians into the army, morals were corrupted, freedom was suppressed, and the craving for possessions increased. In the meantime, while in accordance with a decree of the Senate, armed men were hunting down the family of the Caesars, even those of the female sex, and all their relatives by marriage, by chance Vimius, a native of Epirus and a centurion from the cohorts which were occupying strategic locations throughout the palace, discovered Titus Claudius, concealing himself in a disgraceful hiding-place, dragged him out, and exclaimed to his comrades that if they were smart, there was the emperor. And certainly because he was foolish, he seemed extremely mild to unsuspecting men. This had helped him against the wicked intentions of his uncle Tiberius, and prevented him from being envied by his nephew Caligula. Moreover, he had won over the hearts of the soldiers and plebeians, until he himself could be considered more pitiable than contemptible, through the violent tyranny of his family. As most of them were recalling these facts, the crowd which was present suddenly surrounded him with no opposition, and the rest of the soldiers and a great throng of ordinary people began to flock to him. When the senators had learned this, they quickly sent to see if they could suppress the bold coup. But after the state and people of all ranks were torn by various frightful dissensions, as if on command, they all surrendered. Thus at Rome the royal power was confirmed, and it was all too plainly revealed that men's efforts are rendered vain and futile by fortune. Consequently, Claudius, although he was a shameful slave to his stomach, foolish as well as forgetful, of timid disposition and rather cowardly, nevertheless, mostly because of his apprehension, made some outstanding decisions, particularly on the advice of the nobility, whom he courted through fear. Simple-minded people, you see, do what their advisers tell them. In short, because of his good counsellors, vices were suppressed by him, as were the notorious rites of the Druids throughout Gaul. The most beneficial laws possible were established, military matters were dealt with, frontiers for the Roman Empire were retained or furnished, Mesopotamia in the east, the Rhine and Danube to the north, and in the south the Moors were added to the provinces, since their kings had been removed after Juba. A band of Muslimi were destroyed, and at the same time, in the lands of the extreme west, parts of Britain were subdued, which was the only place he visited, setting out by sea from Ostia, for his generals had taken care of the rest. Furthermore, he relieved the grain shortage which Caligula had brought on when he had collected cargo ships from all over the world, and attempted at the expense of the people to make the sea a thoroughfare for theatres and chariots. Similarly, after he had carried out a new census and had removed quite a lot from the Senate, since he had retained a dissolute young man whose father had asserted that he approved of him, Claudius had justly added that a father should also be a censor for his children. But when he had been dragged into depravity through the enticements of his wife, Messalina, and at the same time of his freedmen, to whom he had subordinated himself, not only were tyrannical acts committed, but also whatever the worst sort of women and slaves are capable of, if their husband or master is a fool. For his wife in the first place committed adultery indiscriminately, as if it were her right, and to such an extent that very many who refused her, whether because of their character or through fear, were killed along with their families, as she, with typical womanly wiles, charged those whom she had solicited with soliciting her. Aroused to greater enormities by this, she forced certain women from the nobility, married and unmarried, to act as prostitutes with herself, like common whores, and men were made to participate. But if anyone recoiled from such depravities, she would fabricate a charge and savagely attack him and his whole family. You see, his own household used to terrify Claudius, who was, as we have shown above, extremely timid by nature, in particular by instilling in him the fear of a conspiracy, so that by means of this machination even his freedmen would ruin whomever they wished. At first they connived in her crimes, but when they became as powerful as their patroness, they killed her too, through their agents, without their master's knowledge, yet as if he had given the command. And indeed, the woman had gone to such extremes that she celebrated a marriage to another man at Rome, when her husband had gone to Ostia to enjoy himself with his mistresses. And she became even more notorious through this, as it appeared astonishing that at the emperor's palace she had married a man other than the emperor. Thus the freedmen, after acquiring complete power, corrupted everything with their depravity, exiles, murders, and proscriptions, and so prevailed upon their master's folly, that though he was an old man, he set his heart on marrying his brother's daughter. Although she was considered more irrational than her predecessor, and therefore feared a similar fate, she murdered her husband with poison. In his 6th year as emperor, although he reigned 14 years, the 800th anniversary of the city was celebrated in magnificent style. And in Egypt, the phoenix was seen, a bird which they say flies every 500 years from Arabia to places which are on record. And in the Aegean Sea, a huge island suddenly emerged one night, during which a lunar eclipse had occurred. Furthermore, the death of Claudius was concealed for a long time, as had once happened in the case of Priscus Tarquinius. While the guards, corrupted by the woman's guile, pretended that he was sick and that the management of the state had been entrusted by him to his stepson, whom he had quite recently adopted. In this manner, Lucius Domitius, for that was certainly Nero's name, since his father was Domitius, was made emperor. He, although he had reigned as many years as his stepfather while a very young man, nevertheless was so outstanding for 5 years, especially in enhancing the city, that Trajan quite often justifiably asserted that all emperors fell far short of Nero in his first 5 years, during which he even reduced Pontus to provincial jurisdiction. With the consent of Polemon, for whose sake it is called Pontus Polemonicus, and similarly the Cottian Alps, after King Cottius had died. Consequently, it is reasonably certain that age is no barrier to virtue, that it is easily transformed if one's nature has been corrupted by unrestricted freedom, and that the law of adolescence, as it were, if it is omitted, recurs more destructively. For Nero, in fact, spent the rest of his life so disgracefully that it is disgusting and shameful to record the existence of anyone of this kind, let alone that he was the ruler of the world. He, while he had begun by singing to the Cythera in public in competition for a crown, a Greek innovation, went to such extremes that he spared neither his own nor anyone else's decency, and finally, dressed in the fashion of young girls getting married, openly in the presence of the Senate, after a dowry had been given, and everyone was celebrating in a festive manner, was married to someone chosen from among all his coterie of perverts. Yet this must be considered rather trivial in his case, for in fact, while decked out in the skin of a wild beast, he would nuzzle the genitals of people of either sex, who had been chained up like criminals, and in an even more disgusting act, he compelled couples to copulate. Furthermore, among these activities, many consider that he even had intercourse with his mother, since she too, in her passion for power, was willing to commit any crime whatsoever to subject him to her. I personally think this is true, although there are writers with different opinions. For in fact, when vices have entered, the human mind in no way feels the obligations of decency in dealing with strangers and in habitual sinning, which leads to novel and therefore sweeter pleasures, finally turning them to their own families. This is demonstrated more forcefully by the following. While she, in a sort of progression, went via other men to marriage with her uncle, and from the torture of strangers to the murder of her husband, he by degrees proceeded to defile a priestess of Vesta, then himself, and finally each defiled the other. Accordingly, when he had violated every law, human and divine, by parricide, and was attacking the nobility with greater and greater violence, many men plotted, naturally at different times, to liberate the state. After these had been betrayed and executed, he decided even more monstrously to destroy the city with fire, the common people with wild beasts let loose everywhere, and the Senate with a similar fate. And he sought a new capital for his empire, principally through the encouragement of the Parthian ambassador, who happened to be at a feast. The entertainers were singing, as is the custom, when he demanded a kithera player for himself. Upon being told in response that the player was a free man, Nero had added that he should take whomsoever he wished from his household, indicating to those who were attending the banquet that under imperial rule no one was considered free. And if Galba, who was governor of Spain, upon learning that his execution had been ordered, had not come to the rescue by seizing power, although he was of advanced age, such a great crime would without doubt have been committed. But at his approach Nero was deserted on all sides except by a eunuch, whom he had once tried to make into a woman by surgery, and he stabbed himself since, although for a long time he begged for someone to kill him, he had not deserved anyone's assistance, even to die. This was the end of the family of the Caesars, which many portents foretold, in particular the withering on their estates of a grove of laurel dedicated to them for their triumphs, and the death of the chickens, which were so numerous and white, and so suitable for religious rites, that even today a place is kept for them at Rome. But when Galba, who was no less noble than they, as a descendant of the extremely renowned family of the Sulpici, had entered Rome, as if he had come to promote excess or even cruelty, he pillaged, plundered, and harassed, and in a disgraceful manner he destroyed and defiled everything. Becoming more detestable through these actions, for those who were expected to govern more mildly offend more grievously, and at the same time, because in his excessive greed for money, he had reduced the pay of the soldiers, he was killed at the instigation of Otho. The latter, hurt insufferably because Galba had preferred to adopt Piso, had led angry armed cohorts into the forum. When Galba, wearing a cuirass, hurried there to quell the disturbance, he was killed near the Locus Curtius on the 7th day of the 7th month of his reign. Consequently, Salvius Otho, once to his shame a close friend of Nero, seized power though he was hardly more than an adolescent. He ruled in a predictable manner for nearly 85 days, but after he had been beaten in a battle at Verona by Vitellius, who had come down from Gaul, he took his own life. Thus the power was passed to Aulus Vitellius, and from such a beginning it would have become progressively more destructive if Vespasian had been detained any longer by the Jewish war which he had undertaken on the orders of Nero. He, when he had learned of Galba's actions, and of his suppression, and also because envoys from the Mosian and Pannonian armies had arrived among those encouraging him, seized the imperial power. For the soldiers mentioned above, after they had discovered that Otho had been made emperor by the Praetorians and Vitellius by the German legions, in rivalry, as is their custom, so that they should not seem different, urged on Vespasian, upon whom the Syrian cohorts had already agreed because of his outstanding qualities. In effect, Vespasian, a senator from a new family with ancestors from Rhaetia, was regarded as a member of the high nobility because of his hard work and his civil and military achievements. When his legionary commanders had crossed into Italy and the Vitellian forces had been routed at Cremona, Vitellius had come to an agreement with Sabinus, the urban prefect and Vespasian's brother, with the soldiers as mediators, that he would abdicate his imperial position for 100 million sesterces. But subsequently, after he imagined that he had been deceived by the reports, with his fury compounded, so to speak, he burned Sabinus and the rest of the opposing faction, together with the capital, which they had seized as a refuge for their safety. But when it was revealed that the reports were true and that his enemies were approaching, he was led out of a porter's hut where he had hidden himself, a noose was tied around his neck, as they do with parasites, and he was dragged to the Gemonian steps and hurled down them. At the same time, his body was stabbed with as many blows as each man could inflict, and was thrown down into the Tiber in the 8th month of his tyranny, when he was more than 57 years old. All these whom I have briefly touched upon, and particularly the family of the Caesars, were so refined in literature and eloquence that, had they not been excessive in all their vices, with the exception of Augustus, their greater talents would surely have cloaked ordinary misdemeanours. Although through these instances it is generally agreed that character is of paramount importance, nevertheless all good men, and especially a supreme ruler, need both qualities equally, if it is possible. Otherwise, if the purpose of life should take a giant step backwards, at least let him assume the dignity of refinement and learning. Vespasian likewise was a man of this kind, honourable in all respects, and not lacking the eloquence to express what he felt, and he quickly restored a world long debilitated and exhausted. For first he preferred to reform rather than torture and destroy the accomplices of tyranny, except for those who had perhaps gone too far in committing atrocities, since he very sensibly realised that evil tasks are carried out by most people through fear. Then he allowed many conspirators to escape with their crimes unpunished, demonstrating in a kindly manner, as was his nature, the foolishness of those who did not know how much work and harassment there was in ruling. At the same time, as a devotee of soothsayers, whose veracity he had ascertained from frequent use, he was confident that he would be succeeded by his sons, Titus and Domitian, furthermore by the fairest of laws, by counselling, and what is even more compelling, by the example of his own life. He eradicated the majority of vices. Nonetheless, he was weak when it came to money, so some people wrongly believe, although it is generally agreed that he had sought new revenues from taxation because of the depletion of the treasury and the ruined state of the cities, and these taxes were not kept in place very long afterwards. For at Rome the capital, which had burned down as I mentioned above, the Temple of Peace, the monuments of Claudius, the massive structure of the amphitheatre, many other buildings too, as well as a forum, were started or completed. In addition, through all the lands where Roman law prevails, cities were restored with exceptional care, and roads were constructed at enormous cost in labour, and the mountains along the Flaminian Way were excavated to make the crossing level. That so many enormous enterprises were completed in a brief time without harming the peasant farmers testified more to his good sense than to his avarice. At the same time, when a census had been held according to ancestral practice, all the more shameful men were removed from the Senate, and 1,000 families were formed from the best men selected from all over the empire. Since he had with the greatest difficulty found only 200 because the majority had been destroyed by the savagery of the tyrants. Furthermore, Vologeses, king of the Parthians, was forced by war to make peace, and the Syrian district which is called Palestine became a province together with the Jews, through the efforts of his son Titus, whom he had left behind for the foreign campaign when he travelled across to Italy, and whom subsequently after his victory he promoted to the Praetorian prefecture. Consequently, that office too, which had been powerful from the beginning, was further inflated and became second to the emperor in authority. But at the present time, when the integrity of public office is despised, the ignorant are confused with the good, and the inept with the capable. Many have made it a title empty of power, arrogant to the poor, but subservient to all the most wicked men, and under the guise of collecting the annual tax, simply rapacious. However, after Titus had acquired the imperial power, it is incredible how much he surpassed the man he imitated, particularly in learning, clemency, and favours. In short, since it was customary for indulgences granted by previous emperors to be confirmed by their successors, as soon as he took power, he voluntarily assured and guaranteed such grants to their possessors by edict. And no less scrupulously he was ready to protect those who had chanced to conspire against him. So much so that when two men of the highest rank were unable to deny the crime that they had planned, and the senators had decreed that they should be punished as confessed criminals, he led them to the show, ordered them to sit on either side of him, deliberately asked a gladiator whose fight they were watching for his sword, and handed it to one of them, and then to the other, as if they should test its sharpness. They were astonished and admired his composure. "Do you see," he said, "that powers are granted by fate, and it is futile to attempt a crime in the hope of acquiring it, or through fear of losing it." So after 2 years and about 9 months, when work on the amphitheatre had been completed in a splendid manner, he died of poisoning in his 40th year, though his father had died in his 70th after being emperor for 10 years. His death was truly such a source of grief for the provinces that they called him the darling of the human race, and mourned for a world that had been left fatherless. And so Domitian, becoming more frantic in his criminal acts, both in public and in private, through the murder of his brother, the best of emperors, began simultaneously to commit the robbery, murder, and torture characteristic of a depraved youth. He became more extravagant in his shameful acts of lust, and treated the Senate with excessive arrogance insomuch as he demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, which was immediately abandoned by his successors, but revived more forcefully later by one emperor after another. But at first Domitian pretended to be compassionate, and since he was not thus far inactive, he appeared quite resolute in both domestic and military affairs. For that reason, after he had crushed the Dacians and a band of Chatti, he renamed the months of September and October, and called the former Germanicus and the latter by his own name, and he completed many of the building projects begun by his father or through the efforts of his brother, in particular the Capitol. From then on he was frightful for his murders of honourable men, and absurdly indolent, for he would send everyone away and chase swarms of flies after finding himself with less energy for sexual pursuits. A disgraceful exercise which he used to call in Greek bed wrestling. This produced a lot of jokes, for when someone asked whether there was anyone in the palace, the reply was, "Not even a fly, unless perhaps in the wrestling room." Accordingly, as his cruelty grew more and more excessive, and therefore he became more mistrusted even by his friends, through a plot of his freedmen, of which his wife was not unaware, for she preferred the love of an actor to her husband's, he paid the ultimate penalty in the 45th year of his life, after a tyrannical reign of approximately 15 years. Then the Senate decreed that he should be buried in the manner of a gladiator, and that his name should be obliterated. The soldiers, angered by this because they had received quite generous private benefits from him at public expense, began in their habitually rebellious manner to seek out those responsible for his death to punish them. Although they were barely restrained, and only with difficulty by sensible men, eventually they came to an agreement with the nobility. Nevertheless, they continued to stir up hostilities by themselves, because the change of government made them resentful at losing the perks provided by Domitian's generous gifts. Up to this time, men born at Rome or in Italy had ruled the empire. Afterwards foreigners did too. Perhaps, as was the case with Tarquinius Priscus, they were far better. And to me at least, from the many things I have heard and read, it is perfectly clear that the city of Rome grew great in particular through the qualities of outsiders and imported talents. For who was wiser or more moderate than the Cretan Nerva? Since he had taken up the supreme power as the choice of the legions in extreme old age, while he lived among the Sequani, where he had retired in fear of the tyrant, when he realised that the position could not be handled except by people mentally more able and physically stronger than he abdicated in the 16th month of his reign, after previously dedicating a forum, which is called the Pervium, where the temple of Minerva rises with even more imposing splendour. While it is always extraordinary to judge what you are capable of and not to be driven on headlong by ambition, it is particularly so in the case of supreme power, which mortals desire to such an extent that they avidly seek it even in extreme old age. Furthermore, he revealed more and more clearly how sensible he was through the merit of his successor. For he adopted Ulpius Trajan, a native of Italica, a Spanish city, but of the highest senatorial order and also of consular rank. It would be difficult to find a more distinguished man than he, whether in civil or in military affairs. Indeed, he was the first or even the only one to extend Roman power across the Danube, when he subdued and formed into a province the bonneted Dacians and Sarmatian tribes under King Decebalus and the Dardanians. At the same time, in the east, he crushed in war all the nations which live between the famous rivers of the Indus and the Euphrates, and he demanded hostages from the king of the Persians, named Chosroes, and amid those achievements he built a road through barbarous nations by which one might easily travel across into Gaul, all the way from the Black Sea. Forts were erected in the more critical and strategic locations. A bridge was constructed over the Danube, and very many colonies were settled. Furthermore, at Rome he improved and decorated in a more than magnificent fashion a forum, and many other structures began by Domitian, and showed an admirable concern for the permanent grain supply, by reviving and strengthening the Guild of Bakers. At the same time, in order that he might be informed more rapidly of whatever state business was being transacted anywhere in the empire, the resources of the public postal system were employed. In fact, this quite useful service turned into the bane of the Roman world through the greed and arrogance of later generations, except that in these recent years its resources have been adequate in Illyricum because of the reforms of the prefect Anatolius. Indeed, there is nothing good or bad in the state that cannot be changed to the opposite by the character of its rulers. Trajan was fair, merciful, extremely patient, and very loyal to his friends. Since he dedicated to his friend Sura the building which is called the Surinae, and was so sure of his integrity that whenever he gave his Praetorian prefect, Suburanus by name, the dagger that was the symbol of his power, as was the custom, he would frequently advise him, "I am entrusting you with this for my protection if I act properly, if not, use it rather on me. For it is less proper for the ruler of all to make any kind of mistake." Furthermore, he had prudently moderated his excessive fondness for wine, a fault with which he was afflicted like Nerva, by prohibiting his orders from being carried out after prolonged banquets. After he had governed the empire with these qualities for almost 20 years, since he was utterly devastated by the severe earthquake at Antioch, and through the rest of Syria, on his way back to Italy at the request of the Senate, he died of an illness at an advanced age, but not before he had appointed Hadrian, his fellow countryman and relative, as emperor, although there are others who think that the imperial power was acquired through the favours of Plotina, Trajan's wife, who had pretended that Hadrian had been designated heir of the throne in her husband's will. Henceforth the titles of Caesar and Augustus were separated, and the practice was introduced into the state of having two or more men share the supreme power, but with different titles and unequal power. and so Aurelius Hadrian, who was more suited for declamation and civil pursuits, established peace in the east, and returned to Rome. There, in the fashion of the Greeks, or Pompilius Numa, he began to give attention to religious ceremonies, laws, schools, and teachers, to such an extent, in fact, that he even established a school of liberal arts, called the Athenaeum, and celebrated at Rome in the Athenian manner the rites of Ceres and Libera, which are called the Eleusinian Mysteries. Then, as is normal in peaceful circumstances, he retired somewhat negligently to his country retreat at Trivoli, leaving the city to Lucius Aulus Caesar. He himself, as is the custom with the fortunate rich, built palaces, and devoted himself to dinner parties, statuary and paintings, and finally took sufficient pains to procure every luxury and plaything. From this sprang the malicious rumours that he had debauched young men, and that he burned with passion for the scandalous attentions of Antoninus, and that for no other reason than he founded a city named after him, or had erected statues to the youth. Some, to be sure, maintain that these were acts of piety and religious scruple, because when Hadrian had wanted to prolong his life, and magicians had demanded a volunteer in his place, they report that although everyone else refused, Antoninus offered himself, and for this reason the honours mentioned above were accorded him. We shall leave the matter unresolved, although with someone of a self-indulgent nature we are suspicious of a relationship between men far apart in age. Meanwhile, after the death of Aulus Caesar, since he himself was not mentally strong enough, and was for that reason treated with contempt, he convened the senators to appoint a Caesar. As they were hurriedly assembling, by chance he caught sight of Antoninus supporting with his hand the faltering steps of an old man, his father-in-law or father. Singularly delighted by this, he gave orders for him to be formally adopted as Caesar, and for a large number of the senators, to whom he had been a laughing-stock, to be immediately executed by him. Not long afterwards he died of consumption at Baiae, at a rather ripe old age, in the 22nd year of his reign, less than a month. On the other hand, the senators were not even swayed by the entreaties of the emperor to accord him the honour of deification, so deeply did they mourn the loss of so many men of their order. However, after those whose death they were grieving suddenly appeared, and each one embraced his relatives and friends, they sanctioned what they had refused. Meanwhile, Helius Antoninus acquired the surname Pius. He was virtually unblemished by the taints of vices. A man of very old family from the municipality of Lanuvium, he was a senator of Rome. He was so far and of such upright character that he plainly showed that perfect dispositions are not corrupted by continuous peace and long-lasting leisure, and in fact that on that account cities will be fortunate if wise men rule them. In short, he remained the same for the 20 years during which he managed the affairs of state, and celebrated in magnificent manner the 900th anniversary of the city. Yet perhaps his lack of triumphs appears to be a sign of inactivity, which is far from the truth, since it is undoubtedly more important that no one dared to disturb the established order, nor did he make war on peaceful nations to make a vain display of himself. Furthermore, lacking male heirs, he provided for the state through the husband of his daughter. For he adopted into his family and into the imperial power Marcus Bonionius, who is known as Aurelius Antoninus, and was from the same town and of equal nobility, but far superior in the pursuit of philosophy and of eloquence. All his actions and decisions, both civil and military, were divinely inspired. But his inability to restrain his wife spoiled this, for she had erupted to such a degree of shamelessness that while staying in Campania, she would hunt the beauty spots along the coast to pick out the sailors, because they mostly work in the nude, who would be particularly suitable for her disgraceful passions. Accordingly, when his father-in-law had died at Lorium at the age of 75, Aurelius straightway admitted his brother Lucius Verus to a share of the power. Under his leadership, the Persians under their king, Vologeses, though at first they had been victorious, finally yielded a triumph. Lucius died within a few days, thus providing material for the invention that he had been destroyed by the treachery of his brother, who they say was vexed with envy at his exploits, and had devised the following deception at dinner. For with one side of a knife smeared with poison he cut a piece of a sow's udder with it, and deliberately set it aside. He ate one slice, and as is customary among close friends, he offered the other, which the poison had touched, to his brother. Only minds with criminal inclinations can believe this of such a great man, especially since it is generally acknowledged that Lucius died of illness at Altinum, a city in Venetia, and that Marcus possessed such wisdom, gentleness, integrity, and learning, that as he was about to march against the Marcomanni with his son Commodus, whom he had substituted as Caesar, he was surrounded by a throng of philosophers begging him not to commit himself to a campaign or battle before he had explained some difficult and very obscure points of the philosophical systems. So in their eagerness for learning, they feared that the uncertainties of war would endanger his safety, and fine arts flourished to such an extent during his reign that I consider precisely this to have been the glory of the times. Ambiguities of the law were admirably clarified, and by eliminating the custom of posting bail, the right of laying a charge and having it disposed on the determined date was duly established. Roman citizenship was granted without discrimination to all, and many cities were founded, settled, restored, or embellished, and in particular Punic Carthage, which fire had terribly ravaged, and Ephesus in Asia, and Nicomedia in Bithynia, which had been levelled by an earthquake, just as Nicomedia was in our time during the consulship of Ceralis. Triumphs were celebrated over nations which, under King Marcomanus, used to extend all the way from the Pannonian city which is called Carnuntum to the centre of Gaul. So in the 18th year of his reign he died in the prime of his life at Vienna, to the very great distress of all people. Finally the senators and common folk, who are divided in other matters, voted everything to him alone, temples, columns, and priests. But his son was considered quite detestable for his despotism, which was savage from its beginning, especially when contrasted with the memory of his predecessors. This is such a burden on successive generations that apart from the common hatred of the undutiful, they are more loathsome for being, as it were, the corrupters of their kind. Clearly energetic in war because of his successes against the Quadi, he had called the month of September Commodus. He constructed a building to serve as a bath that was hardly worthy of Roman might. Indeed, he possessed such an utterly harsh and cruel nature that he frequently butchered gladiators in mock battles, since he would use an iron sword, his opponents' swords made of wood. When he had finished off very many in that manner, by chance one of them, named Sceva, who was very bold, physically powerful, and a skilled fighter, deterred him from this passion. He, spurning his sword, which he saw was useless, said that the one which Commodus was armed with would be sufficient for both of them. Fearing that in the struggle he might have his weapon torn away from him and be killed, which does happen, he had Sceva removed, and now more fearful of the others, he transferred his ferocity to wild beasts. Since all people were horrified at his insatiable bloodthirstiness, through these activities his closest associates in particular plotted against him. In fact, no one was loyal to his regime at all, and even his cronies, by whom the power of those men was maintained, while they were wary of a criminal mind that was inclined to cruelty, thought it safer to overthrow him by any means whatever. and actually sought to poison Commodus, albeit very secretly, at first in about the 13th year of his reign. The poison's strength was rendered ineffective by the food with which he happened to have stuffed himself. Since, however, he was complaining of a stomachache, on the advice of his doctor, a leader of the group, he went to the wrestling hall. There he died at the hands of the mature, for by chance he too was privy to the plot, by having his throat crushed tightly in an armlock, as if it were part of the exercise. When this was known, the Senate, which had gathered in full complement at dawn for the January festival, together with the people, declared him an enemy of the gods and men, and ordered his name to be erased, and straightway the imperial power was conferred upon the prefect of the city, Aulus Helvius Pertinax. He had matched the Curae and Fabrici with his comprehensive learning, really old-fashioned morality, and extreme frugality. The soldiers, to whom nothing seemed sufficient even though the world was already exhausted and ruined, cruelly murdered him at the instigation of Didius on the 80th day of his reign. But meanwhile, Didius Julianus, relying on the Praetorians whose allegiance he had secured with even more extravagant promises, advanced from prefect of the watch to the badge of sovereignty. His family was very noble, and he was distinguished for his knowledge of Roman law. In fact, he was the first to codify the edicts which used to be published by the praetors in varying and confusing ways. Hence it is generally accepted that unless character helps to restrain our passions, learning is a feeble thing, since even this really strict professor of more righteous conduct proceeded to commit the crime which he had decreed punishable by a new penalty. Not long afterwards, however, he did keep with what he had coveted. For as soon as it was learned what had happened, Septimius Severus, who happened to be waging war in distant lands as governor of Syria, was proclaimed emperor, and defeated him in battle near the Milvian Bridge. Men sent to pursue him as he fled cut him down in the palace at Rome. Therefore Septimius Severus, moved by grief and anger at the death of Pertinax, and at the same time because of his hatred for their crimes, immediately cashiered the Praetorian cohorts, and after executing all his opponents, enrolled Helvius among the gods through a senatorial decree. He ordered the name of Salvius and his writings and achievements erased, but this was the one thing that he could not accomplish. So great is the prestige of the learned arts that not even a violent disposition can harm the reputation of writers. Moreover, a death of this kind glorifies them, but makes the agents of the deed detestable, since all men, and especially later generations, consider that those talented individuals could not have been suppressed except through public villainy and madness. All good men must put their faith in this, and I especially, for I was born in the country of a poor and uneducated father, yet I have achieved upper-class status in these times through such important studies. This, in my opinion, is really characteristic of our race, which, by some quirk of fate, is sparingly productive of good men, yet those whom it has raised it extols, each according to his own merits. Like Severus himself, no one in the state has been more distinguished than he. Although he died at an advanced age, the solemnity decreed that he should be mourned with a public holiday and funeral speech, while declaring that it was totally inappropriate for that just man to be born or to die. Clearly this was because they considered him excessive in reforming morality, but after they had attained the level of integrity of their ancestors, just as if they had come to their senses, they considered him compassionate. Thus honesty, which at first is deemed troublesome, when it has been achieved, becomes a source of pleasure and extravagance. He defeated Persenius Niger at Cyzicus, Clodius Albinus at Lyon, and had them killed. Of these, the former, who held Egypt as military governor, had started a war in the hope of gaining supreme power. The latter, who had brought about the assassination of Pertinax, had seized power in Gaul, while he was attempting, through fear of his actions, to cross over to Britain, the province to which he had been appointed by Commodus. Because of the indiscriminate murder of many, he was considered too cruel, and given the surname Pertinax, although many think that he had rather adopted the name himself on account of their similarly parsimonious lifestyles. I am inclined to believe that it was imposed on him because of his harshness, for when one of his enemies, who had gone over to Albinus because of geographical necessity, as is often the case in civil wars, had nevertheless finally concluded his explanation of the reasons by saying, "What, I ask, would you have done if you had been in my place?" He replied, "I would have endured what you will." Nothing is harsher than this saying and action, since good and honourable men blame fortune for dissensions of this kind, however eagerly they have been undertaken, and would rather allow the truth to be distorted to protect citizens than to ruin them. But he in particular wanted to destroy opposition groups so that he might then behave in a gentler fashion, and preferred to punish an act of necessity so that the expectation of pardon might not gradually lead to the collapse of the state through conspiracies, to which he realized minds were inclined because of the fault of the times. Nor do I myself deny that those types of crime which have begun to increase excessively must be eradicated in an almost more than severe manner. He was so successful and skillful, especially in military affairs, that he left no battle except as victor, and he extended the empire by overcoming the king of the Persians, named Abgarus. Similarly, he subdued and reduced the provincial status of the Arabs as soon as he attacked them. He would also have consigned Adiabene to tributary status if he had not despised the barrenness of their territory. On account of these great successes, the senators granted him the titles of Arabicus, Adibenicus, and Parthicus. He undertook enterprises more serious than these, for he defeated the enemy and then protected Britain up to the point where the country was useful, with a wall which he built across the island right up to the ocean at both ends. Furthermore, he drove the warlike tribes away from Tripoli, where his birthplace, Leptis, was situated. These tasks difficult to achieve he would accomplish all the more readily, insomuch as he was implacable with those who failed, but would promote and reward all men of action. Finally, not even petty thefts were allowed to go unpunished, and he was even more careful with his associates, because as a man of experience, he understood that such things were done through the fault of those in command or through factions. He was devoted to philosophy, to oratory, and in short to the study of the liberal arts. Similarly, he wrote an autobiography which was as impressive as it was honest. He established extremely impartial laws. The scandalous behaviour of his wife diminished the outstanding reputation of this man, who was so great at home and abroad, for he was so infamously attached to her that he retained her even after he had learned of her wantonness, and when she was implicated in a conspiracy. This is shameful both to a humble man and to the powerful, but especially to him, since not only were private citizens, individual soldiers and criminals under his control, but also magistrates, armies, and even vices themselves. For when he delayed a campaign because of his gout, and the soldiers felt anxious about it, and elected as Augustus his son Basanius, who was with him as Caesar, he gave orders that he should be carried to the tribunal, and that all who had been responsible for this affair should attend, both the general, the tribunes, the centurions, and the cohorts, and appear as criminal defendants. When the army which had been victorious over such great foes was prostrate on the ground in fear of this, and begged his forgiveness, tapping his head with his hand, he said, Don't you realise that it is the head rather than the feet that rules? Not long afterwards he died of an illness in the British town called York, in the 18th year of his reign. Born of a fairly humble family, he was educated first in literature, then in the law. Dissatisfied with this, as is common for people in limited circumstances, while he was trying various jobs and looking for something better, he climbed to the imperial power. After experiencing graver problems in that position, hard work, cares, fears, and in short, all kinds of uncertainties, as if he were a witness of the human condition, he said, "I have been everything, I have achieved nothing." His body, which his sons Geta and Pausanias had brought to Rome, was honoured in splendid fashion, and buried in the tomb of Marcus, whom he had so admired that for his sake he had persuaded the Senate to enrol Commodus among the gods, and called him his brother, and added the name Antoninus to Pausanias, because it was through the former that he, after many doubtful occurrences, had received the auspicious beginnings of his career through his appointment as advocate of the privy purse. Naturally, those who work their way up remember the beginnings of their success and the people responsible. But his heirs, as if they had received orders to make war on one another, immediately parted company. Accordingly, Geta, whose name came from his paternal grandfather, since his brother was affronted by his gentler nature, was attacked and perished. This victory was made more shameful by the murder of Papinian, at least in the opinion of devoted historians, since they state that he was in charge of Pausanias's secretariats at that time, and was advised, as is the custom, to compose a report for the Roman people as quickly as possible, but he, in his grief for Geta, had said that parricide was not at all easy to conceal, as it was to commit, and therefore he was put to death. But these statements are outrageously absurd, since it is generally accepted that he held the Praetorian prefecture, and could not have rudely heaped such great abuse on the very man whom he loved, and served as a minister of state. On the other hand, Antoninus won over the Roman populace with unheard-of kinds of gifts, since he distributed cloaks which reached the ankles, for which he was called Caracalla. Although in a similar manner he gave the garments the name Antoninians after his own name. He crushed the Alemanni, a populous nation who fight wonderfully from horseback, near the river Main. He was patient, accessible, and calm, and had the same fortune and wife as his father. For captivated by her beauty, he made every effort to marry his mother Julia, whose crimes I have recorded above, since she, in her great eagerness for power, had showed herself unclothed to the gaze of the young man, as if unaware of his presence. When he passionately declared, "I should like, if I may, to," she replied even more shamelessly, for she had stripped off her modesty with her clothes, "You want to? Certainly you may." The cults of Egypt were brought to Rome by him, and the city was endowed with the magnificent addition of a new road, and the construction of a public bath with beautiful fittings. After these had been completed, and while he was travelling through Syria, he died at Edessa, in the 6th year of his reign. His remains were brought back to Rome amid public grief, and were buried alongside those of the Antonines. Afterwards, Aurelius Macrinus, who held the Praetorian prefecture, was declared emperor by the legions, and his son Didymenus, Caesar. Because of their great grief for the emperor they had lost, the soldiers called the young man Antoninus. However, we have discovered nothing about these except that they had cruel and ungracious dispositions. For that reason, when they had with difficulty maintained power for barely 14 months, they were killed by those who had appointed them. Then Marcus Antonius, the son of Bassianus, was summoned. After his father's death, fearing treachery, he had fled for asylum, so to speak, into the priesthood of the sun god, which the Syrians call Heliogabalus, and for this reason he was called Heliogabalus. He transported a statue of the god to Rome and set up an altar in the innermost part of the palace. Not even shameless and wanton women were more depraved than he. In fact, he searched the whole world for the lewdest men so that he might watch them or participate in their practice of filthy obscenities. Since these were multiplying day by day, and love for Alexander, whom the nobility had proclaimed Caesar after learning of Opelius's death, was increasing more and more, Heliogabalus was overthrown in the Praetorian camp, in the 13th month of his reign. Straightway the power of Augustus was conferred upon Aurelius Alexander, who was born in Syria, in the town with the double name Caesarea and Arche, with the support also of the soldiers. He, although a young man, nevertheless possessed an intellect beyond his age, and he immediately made large-scale preparations, and commenced a war against Xerxes, the king of the Persians. After the latter had been defeated and put to flight, Alexander very quickly marched into Gaul, which was being harassed by the plundering raids of the Germans. There he suppressed mutinies in most of the legions with the utmost resolution, which brought him renown for the moment, but subsequently proved fatal. For the soldiers were horrified at the violence of his great severity, from which he had even earned the surname Severus, and they cut him down in a British village named Sicilla, where he happened to be operating with a small retinue. He built for the city a most magnificent monument in his honour, and he was more than dutiful in his reverence for his mother, whose name was Mamaea. Furthermore, he showed how devoted he was to the nobility and the pursuit of justice, by retaining in the same office Domitius Alpinus, whom Heliogabalus had put in command of the Praetorians, and by recalling Paul to his homeland at the beginning of his reign, both being jurists. Although he ruled for not more than 13 years, he left the state strengthened in all respects. It had grown through its struggles from Romulus to Septimius, and by then, because of the policies of Bassianus, it stood at its peak, so to speak. It was due to Alexander that it did not immediately collapse. Henceforth, as long as the emperors were more intent upon dominating their subjects than upon subjugating foreign peoples, and preferred to fight among themselves, they threw the Roman state into a deep decline, as it were, and men were put in power indiscriminately, good and bad, noble and base-born, even many of barbarian extraction. In fact, when there is universal confusion, and nothing is done in its proper manner, all think it right, as is natural amid chaos, to seize the offices of others which they cannot discharge, and they shamefully corrupt any conception of honourable conduct. So the violent power of fortune, once it has acquired unfettered freedom, drives on mortals with destructive desire. For a long time indeed it is restrained by virtue, as if by a wall, but after almost all were overcome by depravity, it entrusted the government even to the lowest in birth and in training. For in fact, Gaius Julius Maximinus, the governor of Treblinka, though he was practically illiterate, was the first common soldier to seize power as the choice of the legions. However, the senators also approved of this, since they considered it dangerous for unarmed men to resist one backed by an army. His son, who had the same name, Gaius Julius Maximinus, was made Caesar. When they had held power for 2 years, and had fought not without success against the Germans, suddenly Antoninus Gordian, the proconsul of Africa, was made emperor by the army at the town of Physterus, though he was not present. When he had been summoned and had arrived there, as if he might be made emperor by doing just that, he was greeted with a mutiny. This he easily suppressed and made for Carthage. There, while he was performing the rites according to custom to avert prodigies, for he was not unreasonably troubled by fear of these, suddenly the victim gave birth. The soothsayers, and he above all, for he was exceptionally skilled in the practice of this art, interpreted it to mean that he in fact was destined to die, but he would procure the imperial power for his children. Continuing further with their prophecy, they foretold the death of his child too, predicting that he would be gentle and innocent like the animal, but would not live long or be subject to treachery. Meanwhile, at Rome, when Gordian's death had been reported, the urban prefect and the rest of the magistrates were murdered in public by the Praetorian cohorts at the instigation of Domitius. Indeed, Gordian, after he had learned that the imperial power had been conferred upon him, had sent envoys and a letter to Rome, promising substantial rewards. When he had been killed, the soldiers were angry at being deceived by these promises, being the sort of men who are very greedy for money and loyal and true solely for profit. But the Senate, since there was no government and the city looked as if it had been occupied, was afraid that worse things would happen, so first it established a board with shared powers, and subsequently conscripted the younger men and appointed Clodius Pupienus and Caecilius Balbinus as Caesars. During the same period in Africa, the soldiers appointed as Augustus Gordian's son Gordian, who happened to be on his father's staff, though he was a young boy, and subsequently Praetorian prefect, and the nobility certainly did not reject this move. Finally, when he had been summoned, the Praetorian detachments were destroyed in combat among the hills of the city and its very centre by bands of gladiators and an army of recruits. While this was taking place at Rome, the two Julii Maximini, who by chance were at that time occupied in Thrace, learned what had happened and hastily made for Italy. At the siege of Aquileia, Pupienus killed them after they had been defeated in battle and their remaining troops had gradually deserted. A year was added to their 2-year reign through delays of this kind. Not long afterwards, Clodius and Caecilius were slain in the palace at Rome during a military revolt, and Gordian became sole ruler. That very year, when he had extended and consolidated the quinquennial games which Nero had introduced to Rome, he set out against the Persians after he had first opened the doors of the Temple of Janus, which Marcus had closed according to ancestral custom. There he conducted a brilliant campaign, but perished in the 6th year of his reign through the intrigues of his Praetorian prefect, Marcus Philippus. And so Marcus Julius Philippus, an Arab from Phracontis, took his son Philip as a partner, settled affairs in the east, founded the town of Philippopolis in Arabia, and came to Rome with his son. They constructed a reservoir on the other side of the Tiber because that region used to be plagued by a shortage of water, and they celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the city with games of all kinds. And since the name has reminded me, in my time too, the 1100th anniversary passed by in the consulship of a Philip, but it was celebrated with none of the customary festivities, so drastically has the concern for the city of Rome diminished day by day. In fact, they say that this was announced at that time by prodigies and portents, one of which I would like to mention briefly. For when some victims were being sacrificed according to pontifical law, female genitals appeared on a hog's abdomen. This the soothsayers interpreted to predict the decadence of later generations and the aggravation of vices. The Emperor Philip, because he thought that this would prove false, and then again, because he had caught sight of a young boy prostitute resembling his son as he happened to walk past him, took very honourable measures to abolish the practice of male prostitution. Nevertheless, it still survives, for if circumstances are altered, it is practised even more outrageously, as long as men seek more avidly whatever is dangerous and forbidden. Furthermore, the Etruscan arts had predicted something quite different, since they asserted that when good men for the most part lie helpless, the most effeminate men would be happy, but I, for one, categorically believe that they were wrong. The fact is that however successfully everything turns out, who can still be happy if he has lost his sense of decency? Yet if that has been retained, everything else is bearable. After completing these projects, he left his son in the city and set out in person against Decius, even though he was physically weak because of his age. He fell at Verona after the defeat and loss of his army. When news of this had reached Rome, his son was killed in the Praetorian camp. They had enjoyed 5 years of power. However, Decius, who was born in a village near Sirmium, had conspired to gain the imperial power by virtue of his military position, and overjoyed at the death of his enemies, had appointed his son named Etruscus as Caesar. He immediately sent the latter ahead to Illyricum, while he remained behind at Rome for a time in order to dedicate the monuments which he had constructed. In the meantime, the head of Jopatianus was suddenly brought to him, as is the custom. He, boasting of his descent from Alexander, had been killed on the authority of the soldiers as he was attempting a rebellion in Syria, and at the same time during those very days the supreme power was offered to Lucius Priscus, who was ruling Macedonia as governor, as a result of an incursion of the Goths, after they had plundered most of Thrace and penetrated that far. When Decius had left Rome as quickly as he could for that reason, Julius Valens seized the imperial power at the urgent insistence of the common people. However, both were soon killed, since the nobility had decreed Priscus an enemy of the state. The Deci, while pursuing the barbarians across the Danube, died through treachery at Abritus after reigning 2 years. But very many report that the death of the Deci was honourable, that in fact the son had fallen in battle while pressing an attack too boldly, and the father, however, while his dejected soldiers were saying many things to console their emperor, had strenuously asserted that the loss of one soldier seemed to him too little to matter, and so he resumed the war and died in a similar manner, while fighting vigorously. When the senators had learned of this, they voted the rank of Augustus to Gallus and Hostilianus, and appointed Volusianus, the son of Gallus, as Caesar. Thereafter a plague broke out, and while it raged ever more violently, Hostilianus died, but Gallus and Volusianus won popular favour, because they meticulously and assiduously arranged the burials of all the poorest folk. Consequently, while they were kept at Rome, Aemilius Aemilianus seized the supreme power by suborning the soldiers. They set out to attack him, but were cut down at Interomna by their own soldiers, who hoped for a greater reward from Aemilius, to whom victory came without labour or losses, and also because they lacked restraint through their self-indulgence and wantonness, and had perverted the duties they owed for the benefits they received. While all of these were in power, however, 2 years elapsed, for Aemilianus, too, ruled moderately for 3 months before being carried off by sickness, and although at first the senators had declared him an enemy, afterwards, when his predecessor had died, in the face of circumstances, as is usual, they acclaimed him Augustus. On the other hand, the soldiers, who had been gathered from all sectors and were detained in Rhaetia because of the impending war, bestowed the empire on Licinius Valerianus. He, although he was of a reasonably distinguished family, was nevertheless pursuing a military career, as was still the custom at that time. The Senate made his son, Gallienus, Caesar, and straightway, though it was high summer, the Tiber overflowed, as if it were in spite. Wise men predicted disaster for the state on account of the changeable nature of the young man, because he had been summoned and had come from Etruria, from where the aforementioned river flows. This in fact immediately occurred, for when his father was engaged in an indecisive and prolonged war in Mesopotamia, he was captured through the treachery of the Persian king, whose name was Sapor, cruelly mutilated, and died in the 6th year of his reign, while still a robust old man. At the same time, although he was strenuously attempting to drive the Germans out of Gaul, Licinius Gallienus hurriedly descended on Illyricum. There at Mursa he defeated Ingebus, the governor of Pannonia, who had conceived a desire to be emperor after learning of Valerian's disaster, and subsequently Regillianus, who had renewed the war after rallying the soldiers who had survived the disaster at Mursa. Since his suppression of these was fortunate and beyond what he had prayed for, like men who are lucky, he became excessively careless, and together with his son, Salonius, on whom he had conferred the rank of Caesar, he shipwrecked the Roman state, so to speak, to such a degree that the Goths freely penetrated Thrace and occupied Macedonia, Achaia, and the border regions of Asia. The Parthians seized Mesopotamia, and bandits, or more accurately a woman, controlled the east. At that time too, a force of Alemanni took possession of Italy, while tribes of Franks pillaged Gaul and occupied Spain, where they ravaged and almost destroyed the town of Tarraconensis, and some, after conveniently acquiring ships, penetrated as far as Africa. Even the territories across the Danube, which Trajan had secured, were lost. Thus, throughout the whole world, the mightiest things were mixed with the small, the lowest with the highest, as if by winds violently gusting from all directions. And at the same time, the plague was ravaging Rome, which often occurs in times of unbearable anxieties and spiritual despair. During these events, Gallienus himself frequented taverns and eating houses, kept up his friendship with pimps and drunkards, and abandoned himself to his wife, Salonia, and to her shameful love affair with the daughter of Attalus, the king of the Germans, whose name was Pippa. For this reason, civil wars also broke out, which were far more frightful. For first of all, Postumus, who happened to be in charge of the barbarians in Gaul, seized the imperial power. After he had driven off a horde of Germans, he was involved in a war with Laelianus, whom he routed just as successfully, but he then perished in a revolt of his own men, supposedly since he had refused to allow them, despite their insistence, to plunder the inhabitants of Mainz, because they had supported Laelianus. At his death, therefore, Marius, a former blacksmith, who was not even then particularly well known to the military, seized power. Accordingly, everything had degenerated so far that imperial powers were bestowed on such individuals, and the dignity of all noble qualities was an object of derision. Indeed, it was because of this that the joke was told that it was hardly surprising if a Marius was attempting to restore the Roman state, since a Marius of the same trade and the founder of the family and name had consolidated it. When he had been murdered after 2 days, Victorianus was chosen, who equalled Postumus in military experience, but was a compulsive lecher. Although he restrained himself at the beginning, he forcibly violated very many women, and after a reign of 2 years, when he forced his attentions on the wife of Atitianus, and she informed her husband of the outrage, the soldiers were secretly incited, and he was killed at Cologne in a mutiny. So powerful were the companies of quartermasters, in whose ranks Atitianus was serving, that their criminal action was accomplished even though they were attempting a difficult task. They are a kind of people, especially in these times, who are worthless, venal, underhanded, rebellious, greedy, and, so to speak, fashioned by nature for committing and concealing frauds. They control supplies, and therefore they are enemies of those collecting the produce and of the well-being of the farmers, since they are proficient in the opportune bribery of those through whose folly and ruin they have amassed their wealth. Meanwhile, Victoria, after the loss of her son Victorianus, bought the approval of the legions with a large sum of money, and made Tetricus emperor. He was of a noble family, and was serving as governor of Aquitaine, and the title and trappings of Caesar were bestowed upon his son, Taraticus. But at Rome, Gallienus was busy dishonestly persuading the people who were unaware of the state's misfortunes that all regions had been pacified, and frequently he even held games and triumphal processions, as is normal when events turn out as one wishes, so that he might more readily substantiate his sham successes. But after danger began to approach, he finally left the city. For Aurelius, since he was in command of the legions in Rhaetia, had seized the imperial power because of the negligence of such an indolent leader, as is customary, and was marching on Rome. Gallienus routed him in battle at the bridge, which is named Aurelius after him, and drove him to Milan. While he was attacking that city with machines of every kind, he was killed by his own men, Aurelius, you see, when he saw that his hopes of raising the siege were futile, cunningly composed a list of the names of Gallienus's generals and tribunes, as if they had been assigned by him for execution, and threw the document down from the wall as secretly as possible. It happened to be found by those mentioned in it, and instilled the fear and suspicion that their deaths had been ordered, but they thought that it had been divulged because of the negligence of his staff. Consequently, in accordance with the plan of Aurelian, whose popularity and prestige in the army were exceptional, they faked an enemy attack, and since he was protected by none of his bodyguards, as is normal in a sudden crisis, they led him out of his tent at the dead of night, and he was run through with a spear by an assailant, who was not identified because of the darkness. Thus his assassination went unavenged, because the actual murderer was not known, or because what had happened was for the common good. Admittedly, moral standards had fallen to such a degree that most men act in their own interests rather than in the interests of the state, and in their eagerness for power rather than for reputation. Hence, too, the essence of things and of titles has been corrupted. While for the most part one who has become more powerful through a crime when he has won the day by arms calls it the removal of tyranny if he suppresses people to the detriment of the state. Moreover, some men who are Gallienus's equals in lust are enrolled in the ranks of the gods, though they are scarcely worthy of the last rites. If the credibility of history had not prevented this, for it neither permits honourable men to be deprived of the rewards of being remembered, nor allows the wicked to acquire an eternal illustrious reputation, virtue would be sought in vain, since that true and unique distinction would be granted through favour to all the worst men, and impiously denied to the good. Eventually the senators were compelled by Claudius to declare Gallienus a god, because he had obtained the imperial power through Gallienus's decision. For when the latter realised by the flow of blood from such a serious wound that death was close, he assigned the imperial insignia to Claudius, who was commanding the garrison force at Ticinum, with the rank of tribune. This was obviously extorted, since the crimes of Gallienus cannot be concealed as long as there are cities, and all the worst emperors will always be considered like him and his equal. Actually, as far as one may conjecture, emperors and the best persons reach heaven, or, through their reputation among men, are celebrated like gods, because of the glory of their lives, rather than because of the titles they have sought and amassed. But the Senate, upon learning of his death, decreed that his followers and friends should be thrown headlong over the Gemonian steps, and it is generally accepted that a treasury lawyer was led into the Senate, and was punished by having his eyes torn out, while a mob burst in, and with equal clamour begged Mother Earth and even the god of the underworld to give Gallienus a place among the damned. And if Claudius had not given orders immediately after the capture of Milan that those who had chanced to survive should be spared, ostensibly because the army had demanded it, the nobility and common people would have run riot even more savagely, and indeed, in addition to the general malaise of the Roman world, the abuse of their own order provoked the senators, because he, fearing that the imperial power would be transferred to the best of the nobility through his sloth, was the first to prohibit the senators from undertaking a military career or entering the army. His reign lasted 9 years. But the soldiers whom the desperate state of affairs compelled, quite contrary to their natural inclination, to make the right decisions, when they realised that everything was in shambles, eagerly approved and praised the accession of Claudius, a man who could endure hard work, was just and totally dedicated to the state, as much so that after a long interval he revived the tradition of the Deci, for when he wanted to drive out the Goths, whom the lapse of time had made excessively strong and virtual inhabitants, it was revealed by the Sibylline books that the foremost man of the most elevated order had to be consecrated to victory, and when the man who seemed to be meant had offered himself, Claudius showed that the responsibility belonged rather to him who was, in fact, the leader of the Senate and all men. Thus the barbarians were routed and driven out with no loss to the army after the emperor had made a gift of his life to the state. In fact, good emperors consider the safety of their fellow citizens and their own enduring reputation more valuable, for these contribute not only to the glory, but also in some ways to the good fortune of their successors. If indeed Constantius and Constantine and our own emperors, here there is a gap in the text, and of her body, she was more acceptable to the soldiers because of their expectations of rewards or license. Consequently, the victory was sad and rather troublesome, since subjects, as is their custom, more readily defend lax regimes than useful ones, through their desire to commit crimes with impunity. Furthermore, Aurelian, made more impetuous by his great success, immediately marched against the Persians, as if the war were in its final stages. He defeated them and returned to Italy, where the cities were being harassed by the incursions of the Alemanni. At the same time, when the Germans had been driven out of Gaul, the legions of Taraticus, whom we have mentioned above, were cut down after being betrayed by their own general, for Taraticus because he was frequently being assailed by his soldiers, who had become corrupted by the intrigue of the governor, Faustinus, had begged for the protection of Aurelian by letter, and since the battle line had been led forward for appearance's sake, during the fighting he surrendered to Aurelian as he approached. So, as is usual when there is no commander, the ranks were thrown into confusion and crushed. Taraticus himself, after 2 years of exalted power, was led in the triumph, but then obtained the governorship of Lucania, and for his son pardon and senatorial rank. In the same manner, the mint workers in the city were destroyed. Since at the instigation of the treasurer they had been filing off the coin marks in fear of punishment, they had fought so serious a war that after gathering on the Caelian hill, they killed about 7,000 troops. After so many great successes, he constructed a magnificent temple to the sun at Rome, decorating it with opulent offerings, and to prevent what had occurred under Gallienus from ever happening again, he enclosed the city with the strongest walls possible, and enlarged their perimeter. At the same time, he carefully supervised generous supplies of pork, so that he might allocate sufficient quantities to the Roman populace. False charges laid by treasury officials or informers which had distressed the city were suppressed, registers and documents of dealings of this kind were burned, and an amnesty was decreed in the Greek manner. In the meantime, he rigorously prosecuted acts of greed, embezzlement, and those committing extortion in the provinces, contrary to the customary behaviour of the military from whose ranks he came. For this reason he was entrapped and killed at Conophrium through the villainy of an assistant to whom he had entrusted the office of confidential secretary, since the man, conscious of his graft and criminal activity, had handed over to the tribunes, as if doing them a favour, cunningly composed letters containing orders for their execution. Alarmed by fear of that, they committed the crime. Meanwhile, the soldiers, once they had lost their emperor, immediately sent envoys to Rome to ask the senators to select an emperor of their own choice. When they replied that this was the particular responsibility of the soldiers, the legions again referred it to them. Thus the matter was debated with propriety and moderation on both sides, virtues rare among people, especially in matters of this kind, and almost unheard of with soldiers. So much did the man achieve by his severity and incorruptibility, that the announcement of his murder brought destruction to the perpetrators, was a source of fear to the wicked, and also to those wavering, a cause of regret to all the best men, and a source of arrogance or ostentation to none. And furthermore, a sort of interregnum occurred, as it had for Romulus alone, but far more glorious. This action in particular demonstrated that everything revolves in the manner of a circle, and nothing happens which the power of nature cannot reproduce in the course of time, and in addition, that even desperate situations are easily relieved by the virtues of emperors, and more stable ones abruptly ruined by their vices. Finally, therefore, in about the 6th month after the death of Aurelian, the Senate made Tacitus, one of their former consuls, emperor. He was certainly a kind man, and practically everyone was happier because the senators had recovered the right to choose the emperor from the arrogant military. This joy, however, was brief, and it did not have a tolerable outcome, for Tacitus soon died at Tinaia on the 200th day of his reign, but not until after he had first tortured to death the murderers of Aurelian, and in particular their ringleader, Mucipor, because he had struck the actual blow, and Florianus, Tacitus's brother, seized power without any decision being made by the Senate or the soldiers. He, when he had held the absolute power tenuously for 1 or 2 months, was killed at Tarsus by his own men, after they had accepted Probus, who had been proclaimed in Illyricum, and was almost a second Hannibal because of his great knowledge of warfare, and his versatile training of the soldiers, and his toughening of the young recruits. For just as Hannibal considered the inactivity of his troops dangerous to the state and its leaders, and filled many parts of Africa with olive trees through their labour, in the same manner Probus filled Gaul, the Pannonians, and the hills of Moesia with vineyards, naturally after he had crushed the barbarian tribes which had invaded when our emperor had been killed by the treachery of their own men. At the same time, Saturninus was cut down in the east, and Bonosus with his army at Cologne, for both had attempted to seize supreme power with the bands of troops they had commanded as generals. For this reason, when all those regions had been recovered and pacified, it is reported that he stated that in a short time soldiers would be unnecessary. Eventually, therefore, they became even more incensed, and they cut him down at Sirmium after a little less than 6 years, as he was compelling them to drain the city, his birthplace, with reservoirs and a ditch, since it was damaged by winter rains on account of its marshy soil. From this point on, the power of the military increased, and the right of appointing the emperor was snatched from the Senate up to our own times. Though it is uncertain whether the Senate desired this through apathy or fear, or because of its hatred of civil conflicts. In fact, it could have regained its right to military service, which had been lost through the Edict of Gallienus during the reign of Tacitus, when the legions were duly compliant, and Florianus would not have rashly seized power, nor would it have been granted to any man, however good, by the decision of the common soldiers, if members of that distinguished and honourable order had been serving in the army. But as long as they find their gratification in leisure and simultaneously fear for their wealth, the enjoyment and abundance of which they consider more important than what is eternal, they paved the way for the soldiers and virtually for the barbarians to have absolute power over themselves and their descendants. Consequently, Carus, who was powerful because he held the Praetorian prefecture, was clothed in the imperial robe, and his sons, Carinus and Numerian, became Caesars. And since all the barbarians had seized the opportunity to invade once they had learned of the death of Probus, he sent his elder son to defend Gaul, and accompanied by Numerian, he straightway proceeded to Mesopotamia, because that land is, so to speak, a customary cause of war with the Persians. There, after routing the enemy, while he was advancing beyond Ctesiphon, Parthia's famous city, with an ill-advised and excessive desire for glory, he was burnt to death by a bolt of lightning. Certain men state that he deserved this, for although the oracles had informed him that through his victory he was permitted to reach the city just mentioned, he advanced further and paid the penalty. So you see, it is hard to divert the fates, and for that reason knowledge of the future is pointless. However, Numerian, after losing his father, at the same time decided that the war was over, but while he was leading his army back, he was murdered through the treachery of Aper, the Praetorian prefect, and his father-in-law. An infection of the young man's eyes proved the opportunity for this. In short, the deed was concealed for a long time, while the body was being carried in a closed litter on the pretext that he was ill, so that his eyesight might not be troubled by the wind. But after the crime had been betrayed by the odour of his decomposing limbs, at a council of generals and tribunes, Valerius Diocletian, commander of the household troops, was selected because of his good sense. He was a great man, yet he had the following characteristics. He was in fact the first who really desired a supply of silk, purple and gems for his sandals, together with a gold brocaded robe. Although these things went beyond good taste and betrayed a vain and haughty disposition, they were nevertheless trivial in comparison with the rest, for he was the first of all after Caligula and Domitian to permit himself to be called Lord in public, and to be worshipped and addressed as a god. From these indications, as far as I can understand, I have concluded that all men from the humblest backgrounds, especially when they have attained exalted positions, are excessive in their pride and ambition. For this reason Marius, in our ancestors' times, and he in ours, went beyond the common limits, since a mind that has never experienced power is insatiable, like a man saved from starvation. Consequently, it seems strange to me that most people accuse the nobility of arrogance, whereas, in preserving the memory of its patrician origins, it has some right to assert its eminence as compensation for the annoyances by which it is afflicted. But these faults in Diocletian were effaced by the other good qualities, and especially by the fact that although he allowed himself to be called Lord, he acted like a parent. And it is fairly certain that this shrewd man wanted to demonstrate that it was the harshness of circumstances rather than of titles that created obstacles. Meanwhile, Caranius, informed of what had happened, and in the hope that he might more easily put down the revolts which were breaking out, hastily made for Illyricum by skirting Italy. There he scattered Julianus' battle line and cut him down, for the latter, while he was governing the Veneti as corrector, had learned of Carus' death, and in his eagerness to seize the imperial power, had advanced to meet the approaching enemy. Moreover, when Carinus reached Moesia, he straightway joined battle with Diocletian near Margus, but when he was in hot pursuit of his defeated foes, he died under the blows of his own men, because he could not control his lust, and used to seduce many of his soldiers' wives. Their husbands had grown increasingly hostile, but they had nonetheless put aside their anger and resentment to see how the war turned out, since it was going quite successfully for him, in fear that a man of such character would become more and more overbearing in victory. They avenged themselves. That was the end of Carus and his children. Narbonne was their native city. They ruled for 2 years. Consequently, Diocletian in his first speech to the army drew his sword, gazed up at the sun, and while attesting that he had no knowledge of Numerian's murder, and had not wanted the imperial power, with one blow he transfixed Aper, who was standing right beside him. It was through his treachery, as we have shown above, that the good and eloquent young man, his son-in-law, had perished. Pardon was granted to the rest, and practically all the enemy were retained, especially one outstanding man named Aristobulus, the Praetorian prefect, on account of his services. This was a novel and unexpected occurrence in the history of mankind, that in a civil war no one was stripped of his possessions, reputation, or rank, for we are delighted if such a war is waged with all due observances, and with mercy, and if a limit is set on exiles, proscriptions, and also on punishments and murders. Why should I recount that many men, foreigners too, have been admitted into partnership in order to protect and extend Roman authority? For when Diocletian had learned after Carinus' death that in Gaul Helianus and Amandus had stirred up a band of peasants and robbers whom the inhabitants call Bagadae, and had ravaged the region far and wide, and were making attempts on very many of the cities. He immediately appointed as Emperor Maximian, a loyal friend who, although he was rather uncivilized, was nevertheless a good soldier of sound character. He subsequently received the surname Herculius from his worship of Hercules, just as Valerius received that of Jovius. This was also the origin of the names given to those auxiliary units which were particularly outstanding in the army. Well, Herculius marched into Gaul, and in a short time he had pacified the whole country by routing the enemy forces, or accepting their surrender. In this war, Carausius, a citizen of Menapia, distinguished himself by his clearly remarkable exploits. For this reason, and in addition because he was considered an expert pilot, he had earned this living at his job as a young man. He was put in charge of fitting out a fleet and driving out the Germans who were infesting the seas. Because of this appointment, he became quite arrogant, and when he had overcome many of the barbarians, but had not turned over all the booty to the public treasury, in fear of Herculius, who he learnt had ordered his execution, he seized the imperial power and made for Britain. At the same time, the Persians were causing serious disturbances in the east, and Julianus the Quinquentian peoples in Africa. Furthermore, at Alexandria in Egypt, someone named Achilles had donned the insignia of supreme power. For these reasons, they, Diocletian and Maximian, appointed as Caesars and made marriage alliances with Julius Constantius and Galerius Maximinus, whose surname was Armentarius. After annulling their previous marriages, the former received the stepdaughter of Herculius, the latter Diocletian's daughter, which is what Augustus had once done in the case of Nero Tiberius and his daughter Julia. Illyricum was actually the native land of all of them, so although they were deficient in culture, they had nevertheless been sufficiently schooled by the hardships of the countryside and of military service to be the best men for the state. Consequently, it is evident that men are more readily made honourable and sensible by enduring adversity, whereas, on the other hand, those who have not experienced misfortunes, as long as they judge everyone according to their own situations, are less considerate. But the harmony of these rulers has definitely demonstrated that natural ability and the experience of a successful military career, such as they received through the precedent of Aurelian and Probus, are practically sufficient to ensure merit. Finally, they used to look up to Diocletian as a father, or like a mighty god. The nature and importance of this attitude have been made conspicuous by the crimes committed by relatives from the founding of the city to our own times. And since the burden of wars, which we have mentioned above, was pressing more intensely, the empire was divided into 4 parts, and all those regions of Gaul which lie across the Alps were entrusted to Constantius, Africa and Italy to Herculius, the coast of Illyricum right across to the Strait of Pontus to Galerius. Diocletian retained the rest. As a consequence, then, the immense evils of taxation were imposed upon part of Italy, for although all Italy paid the same moderate levy to support the army and the emperor, who were always or mostly there, a new law for making payments was introduced. It was no doubt bearable in that period of moderation, but has grown into a ruinous monster in these tempestuous times. Meanwhile, Jovius set out for Alexandria, and his area of command was entrusted to Maximian Caesar, so that the latter might leave his territories and advance into Mesopotamia to repel the attacks of the Persians. At first he was seriously troubled by them, but he quickly gathered an army of veterans and recruits and marched against the enemy through Armenia, which is almost the only, or at least the easiest route to defeat them. There he eventually captured King Narses, together with his children, his wives, and his royal household. He was so successful that if Diocletian, at whose command all state affairs were conducted, had not for some unknown reason forbidden it, the Roman fasces would now be carried in a new province. but some of the territories which were nevertheless quite useful to us were acquired. The recent very serious and destructive war broke out because they are now being demanded back with great insistence. But in Egypt, Achilles was easily put down by negotiations and paid the penalty. In Africa the situation was dealt with in a similar manner, and only Carausius was allowed to retain his sovereignty over the island after he had been judged quite competent to command and defend its inhabitants against warlike tribes. He in fact was treacherously overthrown 6 years later by a man named Electus, who after he had been entrusted by the former to manage the treasury, fearing execution because of his misdeeds, had seized power through a criminal act. When he had exercised power for a short while, Constantius destroyed him through Asclepiodus, who was his praetorian prefect, and was sent ahead with a detachment of the fleet and of the legions. In the meantime, too, the Marcomanni were slaughtered, and the whole nation of the Carpi was transferred to our soil, where some of them had already been settled from the time of Aurelian, and with no less regard for the concerns of peace. The bureaucracy was regulated by the most impartial laws, and the abolition of that malignant clan of Fumentiari, to whom our current intelligence agents are very similar, although they appear to have been established to investigate and report whatever disturbances might crop up in the provinces, by outrageously fabricating charges and inspiring fear everywhere, especially in the most remote areas. They would shamefully plunder everything. At the same time, the city grain supply and the welfare of the taxpayers were carefully and responsibly safeguarded, and by the promotion of a better class of men, and on the other hand by the punishment of all villains, enthusiasm for virtues began to increase. The most ancient religious cults were looked after with the utmost respect, and in a marvellous manner the hills of Rome and the other cities, especially Carthage, Milan, and Nicomedia, were embellished with hitherto novel and beautifully elaborate buildings. Nevertheless, in spite of these achievements, they were not without faults. In fact, Herculius was so driven by lust that not even the bodies of his hostages were safe from his sick desires. Diocletian had too little genuine faith in his friends, doubtless through his fear of conflicts, since he thought that the harmony of the partnership might be disturbed by disclosures. For this reason, too, the forces of the city were, so to speak, pruned down, when he reduced the number of praetorian cohorts and common citizens under arms, and very many believe that it was indeed on this account that he had laid down the imperial power, for in fact he was a close examiner of imminent events, and when he discovered that on account of fate, internal disasters, and as it were a sort of disintegration of the Roman state was threatening, he celebrated the 20th year of his reign, and while still in good health, he gave up the administration of the state, after he had with very great difficulty converted Herculius, who had been in power 1 year fewer, to his point of view. And although regard for the truth has been corrupted because people have different opinions, nevertheless it seems to me that he spurned ambition and stepped down to ordinary life because of the excellence of his character. Consequently, since Constantius and Armentarius succeeded them, Severus and Maximinus, natives of Illyricum, were appointed Caesars, the former for Italy, the latter for the regions which Jovius had held. Unable to tolerate this, Constantine, whose proud and capable spirit had been stirred up ever since boyhood by a passion to rule, reached Britain in a planned escape, since he killed all the post-horses along the route which he had travelled in order to frustrate his pursuers, for he was being detained by Galerius as a hostage on the pretext of obligation. And by chance at the same time and in the same place his father Constantius was approaching the last days of his life. At his death, with the support of all who were present, Constantine assumed the imperial power. Meanwhile at Rome, the common people and the Praetorian units confirmed Maxentius as emperor. Although for a long time his father Heraclius restrained him, when Armentarius learned of this, he hastily ordered Severus Caesar, who happened to be near the city, to engage the enemy. The latter, while he was operating around the walls, was deserted by his men, whom Maxentius had suborned with the inducement of rewards, and fled to Ravenna, where he was besieged and died. Galerius was further enraged by this, and after consulting Jovius, he installed Licinius, a long-standing friend, as Augustus, and leaving him to guard Illyricum and Thrace, he marched on Rome. While he was being held up there by the siege, since his soldiers were being tampered with in the same way as their predecessors, he abandoned Italy in fear that he might be deserted. Shortly afterwards, when he had made an area in Pannonia quite useful to the state by cutting down vast forests and draining Lake Pelso into the Danube, he died from an infected wound. Because of this he called the province Valeria after his wife's name. He ruled for 5 years, Constantius for 1, although of course both held the rank of Caesar for 13 years. They were so remarkable for their natural abilities that if those abilities emanated from cultivated minds and did not give offence because of their boorishness, without doubt they would be considered exceptional. Consequently, it is indisputable that learning, refinement, and courtesy are essential, particularly in emperors, since without these qualities natural talents are despised as if they are unrefined or even crude, yet on the other hand, those very qualities assured Cyrus, king of the Persians, of everlasting glory. Moreover, within my own memory, they carried Constantine up to the stars with the prayers of all, even though he demonstrated other such virtues. Certainly, if he had set a limit to his lavishness and ambition, and to those practices in particular to which mature men of genius progress in their quest for glory, and through which they fall too far in the opposite direction, he would have been practically a god. When he learned that the city and Italy were being devastated, and that 2 armies and 2 emperors had been driven off or bought off, he made a peace throughout Gaul, and marched against Maxentius. At that critical time, on Punic territory, Alexander, who was acting as deputy prefect, had foolishly usurped the supreme power, although he himself was enfeebled by age, was more dull-witted than his parents, who were Pannonian peasants, and his soldiers had been recruited in a hurry, and had hardly half their weapons. To sum up, Rufius Volusianus, the Praetorian prefect, and some generals were dispatched with a mere handful of cohorts by the pretender, Maxentius, and they polished him off in a minor skirmish. After his defeat, Maxentius, the inhuman beast, made more abominable by his excessive lust, had ordered Carthage, the glory of the world, along with the loveliest parts of Africa, to be ravaged, pillaged, and burned. In addition, he was an unwarlike coward, and shamefully inclined to indolence to such a degree that, while war was raging throughout Italy and his troops had been routed at Verona, he went about his customary business with no less apathy, and was unmoved by the destruction of his father. For you see, Heraclius, who was more intractable by nature, and at the same time dismayed by his son's apathy, had rashly sought to regain the imperial power. And as he was plotting to make a vicious attack on his son-in-law Constantine, on the pretext of doing him a service, he had eventually met a deserved death. But Maxentius, growing more ruthless by the day, finally advanced with great difficulty from the city to Saxa Rubera, about 9 miles away. His battle line was cut to pieces, and as he was retreating in flight back to Rome, he was trapped in the very ambush he had laid for his enemy at the Milvian Bridge, while crossing the Tiber in the 6th year of his tyranny. It is incredible how joyful and delighted the Senate and people exulted at his death, for he had oppressed them so much that on one occasion he permitted the Praetorians to massacre the common people, and was the first from a most reprehensible edict issued under the pretext of obligatory state taxation, to compel the senators and farmers to contribute money for him to squander. Because of their aversion, the Praetorian legions and the support units, which were more useful to factions than to the city of Rome, were entirely eliminated, together with the bearing of arms and the wearing of military uniforms. In addition, All the monuments which Maxentius had constructed in magnificent manner, the temple of the city and the basilica, were dedicated by the Senate to the meritorious services of Flavius. He also afterwards completed the decorations on the Circus Maximus in a marvellous fashion and built a bathing establishment which was not very different from the others. Statues were erected in the busiest places, and most of them are of gold or silver. Then in Africa a college of priests was dedicated to the Flavian gens, and the town of Cirta, which had been demolished during the siege of Alexander, was rebuilt, fully redecorated, and given the name of Constantina. Indeed, nothing is more welcome and more distinguished than those who expel tyrants, and respect for them will actually be so much greater if they are moderate and self-restrained. Naturally, people's spirits, once they are disappointed in their expectations of something good, are hurt more grievously when the abundance of their hardships remains in spite of the removal of a shameful ruler. When these events were taking place in Italy, in the east, Maximinus, after ruling 2 years as Augustus, was routed and put to flight by Licinius, and perished at Tarsus. Thus the control of the Roman world was acquired by two men who, although they were connected to each other by the marriage of Flavius's sister to Licinius, nevertheless because of their diverse characters only managed to coexist with difficulty for 3 years. For you see, the former possessed other great qualities beyond measure, the latter only frugality, and that, to be sure, of merely a rustic nature. Finally, Constantine received all his enemies with honour, and protected them by allowing them to retain their properties, and was so conscious of his obligations that he was also the first to abolish the long-established and utterly frightful punishment of the forked gibbet and the breaking of legs. Consequently, he was regarded as a founder or as a god. Licinius carried out tortures reserved for slaves in unlimited numbers, even on innocent philosophers of noble rank. He was indeed defeated in various battles, but since it seemed difficult to suppress him completely, and at the same time, because of their marriage ties, the partnership was renewed, and their respective children, Crispus and Constantine, the sons of Flavius, and Licinianus, the son of Licinius, were admitted to the rank of Caesar. It was in fact made clear that this would hardly be a long-lasting agreement, or propitious for those who were added, since daylight was obliterated by a solar eclipse during those same months. Accordingly, 6 years later, peace was broken. Licinius was defeated in Thrace and withdrew to Chalcedon. There, after he had admitted Martinianus to the imperial power to assist him, the two were suppressed together. In that way the state began to be ruled by the will of one man, while his children retained their distinct titles of Caesar. In fact, it was at that critical time that the rank of Caesar was given to our current emperor, Constantius. When the eldest of these had died on the orders of his father, for unknown reasons, suddenly Calocreus, commander of the imperial camel herd, insanely seized the island of Cyprus and pretended to rule. He was tortured to death like a slave or a robber, as was right and proper, and the emperor turned his remarkable mind to founding a city, regulating religious practices, and simultaneously reorganizing the military. In the meantime, too, the tribes of the Goths and Sarmatians were subdued, and the youngest of all his sons, Constans by name, was made Caesar. Astonishing omens announced that because of him there would be turmoil in the state. In fact, on the very night which followed the day of his imperial appointment, the face of heaven blazed with continuous fire. About 2 years after this, Constantine designated as Caesar his brother's son, who was named Dalmatius after his father, even though the soldiers vigorously objected. Thus in the 32nd year of his reign, after he had controlled the whole world for 13 years, and was more than 62 years old, as he was marching against the Persians, who had just caused a war to break out, he died in a country villa very close to Nicomedia. They call it Anchirona, as that star, so fatal to rulers, which they call a comet, had portended. His body was carried back to the city bearing his name. This certainly upset the Roman people very seriously, since they thought that it was through his arms, his laws, and merciful rule that the city of Rome had been practically renewed. A bridge was built across the Danube. Camps and forts were strategically placed in many locations. The extraordinary requisitions of grain and oil which used to distress Tripoli and Nicaea quite seriously were removed. The inhabitants of the former of these cities, delighted that Severus was emperor, had given these as an offering to their fellow citizen, but duplicity had turned the gratitude owed for these services into the ruin of later generations. Marcus Boionius had punished the other with a fine because they had been unaware that Hipparchus, a man of outstanding genius, had been a native of their city. Fiscal abuses were severely repressed, and everything would have appeared to be in accord with divine principles if he had not admitted unworthy men to public office. Although this happens all too often, nevertheless, in a ruler of the highest character, and in a state which enjoys exemplary moral conduct, faults, however small, are most conspicuous, and consequently are easily noticed. In addition, they often do more serious harm, since, because of the esteem of their author, they are most readily accepted as virtues and encourage imitation. Therefore Dalmatius was promptly killed, though it is uncertain at whose instigation, and just 3 years later, more or less, Constantine II fell in a fateful war. Because of this victory, Constans became more arrogant, and at the same time, he was willful and insufficiently cautious on account of his age. Furthermore, he was detestable because of the depravity of his subordinates, and passionate in his greed and in his contempt for the soldiers, and in the 10th year after his triumph he was overthrown by Magnentius' criminal act, although he had certainly suppressed the uprisings of foreign tribes. Because he had treated too attentively the hostages taken from him, rather attractive boys, whom he had sought out and paid for, it was justifiably believed that he burned with a passion of this kind. Yet would that these vices had continued, for everything was so devastated by the awful savage character of Magnentius, as is natural with a barbarian, and simultaneously by what happened afterwards, that people not without reason longed for the previous reign. It was also because Ventranio, an utter illiterate and quite dull-witted, and consequently the worst choice because of his rustic stupidity, while he was commanding the soldiers throughout Illyricum as master of the infantry, had shamelessly seized supreme power, although he hailed from the more barren regions of Upper Moesia. Constantius toppled him from the imperial power within 10 months by the force of his eloquence, and relegated him to private life. He alone, since the birth of the empire, achieved glory through his power of speech and his clemency, for when a large segment of both armies had gathered together, an assembly was held in the manner of a court, and he achieved by his eloquence what could scarcely be obtained by force or much bloodshed. This event adequately demonstrated that the ability to express oneself well is vitally important, not only in civil affairs but also in military matters. In short, with this ability even arduous enterprises are all the more effortlessly accomplished if the speaker excels in moderation and integrity. This is particularly evident from the case of our own emperor. Nonetheless, a severe winter and the closing of the Alpine passes hindered him from immediately marching on Italy against his other enemies. Meanwhile at Rome, because the common people had been corrupted and Magnentius was hated as well, Neopotanius, a relative of Flavius through his mother's family, was made emperor by a band of armed gladiators after the urban prefect had been murdered. His brutish nature was so destructive to the Roman people and the senators that everywhere the houses, squares, streets, and temples were filled with gore and corpses, like tombs. Nor was this done by him alone, but also by the advancing troops of Magnentius, who had struck down their enemy on the 27th day. But already prior to this, Since they suspected uprisings abroad, Magnentius had entrusted the Gallic provinces to his brother, Decentius as Caesar, and Constantius the East to Gallus, whose name he had changed to his own, also as Caesar. They themselves met in quite bitter battles over a 3-year period. Finally, Constantius pursued Magnentius as he fled into Gaul, and drove both adversaries to commit suicide by different means. And in the meantime, a revolt of the Jews, who had criminally elevated Patricius to a sort of kingship, was suppressed. Not long afterwards, because of his cruelty and violent disposition, Gallus perished on the orders of the Augustus. Thus, after a long interval of almost 70 years, the care of the state was returned to one man. Its newly acquired respite from civil turmoil again began to be disturbed when Silvanus was forced to assume the imperial power. This man Silvanus, you see, had been born in Gaul of barbarian parents and came from the military class. Furthermore, by his desertion from Magnentius to Constantius, he had earned his promotion to Master of the Infantry, though he was a relatively young man. When he had climbed still higher from that rank, through fear or madness, he was slaughtered on about the 28th day during a mutiny of the legions, from which he had hoped for protection. For this reason, so that there might be no rebellion among the Gauls, who are headstrong by nature, especially because the Germans were ravaging most of those districts, Constantius appointed Julian as Caesar in command of the Transalpine regions, since he was acceptable to him by virtue of their family relationship, and the later quickly subdued those fierce nations and captured their famous kings. Although those exploits were accomplished by his vigour, they nevertheless came about through the good fortune and planning of the emperor. This is so important that Tiberius and Galerius achieved very much that was outstanding when serving others, but under their own authority and auspices they accomplished far less. Moreover, Julius Constantius, who has been ruling as Augustus for 23 years, has hardly had a break from campaigning since he has been engaged in disturbances abroad, and just recently in civil ones. Through these campaigns he removed many a powerful pretender, and in the meantime he withstood an attack by the Persians, and he appointed a king to the Sarmatian people, while he was with great honour seated as a judge among them. This is something very few of our ancestors did, though we have ascertained that Gnaeus Pompey did this when he restored Tigranes. Constantius is calm and reasonable in his duties, versed in literature to the point of elegance, and has a gentle and agreeable manner of speaking. He is tolerant of hard work and wonderfully quick at shooting arrows, and master of his eating habits, of every passion, and all his desires. He is reasonably dutiful regarding the respect owed to his father, but excessively concerned with that owed to himself. He is aware that the tranquillity of the state is governed by the lives of good emperors. These qualities, so great and so renowned, have been tarnished by his inadequate attention to approving provincial governors and military commanders, and at the same time by the incongruous character of most of his officials, and furthermore by his neglect of all the best sort of men. And to end on a brief note of truth, just as no one is more outstanding than the emperor himself, so nothing is more frightful than the majority of his subordinates.